Science is supposed to serve the truth. And scientists are supposed to speak truth to power. And it has always been like this, for centuries. But we're living in a post-truth age. And in an increasingly charged international environment, science risks becoming part of a grander geostrategic scheming. The Brandt Lecture 2025 will address this dilemma, and I hope it will possibly also show us how to navigate the way forward. With this, it is my utmost pleasure to welcome and introduce our speaker of honor of today, Professor Dr. Bettina Rockenbach, the president of the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, and professor for experimental and behavioral economics at the University of Cologne. A great welcome. She's an economist by training, and she specializes in the mechanisms to promote cooperation in dilemma situations, social and economic dilemma situations, and she's interested in fostering socially responsible economic action. Her expertise is on pressing conflicts of humanity, such as resource distribution, climate protection, global health, things that are very, very close to our heart at the Brandt School. She's the first woman to lead the Academy, and she has a long-standing career in academics. She's the director of the Reinhard Selten Institute at the Universities of Bonn and Cologne. She has been that since 2018. She's a senior research fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Research on Collective Goods, and her scientific work has been awarded with various prizes and recognitions, including the Hendrik Casimir Carl Ziegler Award of the North Rhine-Westphalian Academy of Sciences and Arts and the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. And I'm proud to add, she's one of our own. She is. Before she took a job and a professorship at the University of Cologne, she was a professor of microeconomics with a focus on industrial economy here at the University of Erfurt. Ladies and gentlemen, dear guests of honor, we are honored for her to hold the Brandt Lecture 2026, which is titled, How Free is Science in the Era of Geopolitical Upheaval? Professor Rockenbach, the floor is all yours.
So, also a warm welcome from my side. So, dear Director, Professor Goldthau, dear Vice Director, Professor Grimm, dear Heike, dear community of the University of Erfurt and the Willy Brandt School, dear graduates of the Willy Brandt School, most importantly, you. It's very nice to look in all these faces here in the first rows. So this is a privilege of ours from standing here to have this very nice picture of all of you. And dear representatives of academia, politics, business, civil society, ladies and gentlemen, and maybe also guests from town that came here to celebrate this. Well, it's my great pleasure to be here to speak to you. And as mentioned before, I have a close connection to Erfurt. I was professor here from 2000 to 2011, so some of you I know from the studies already here, and it was a great time, and I always remember this great time at the University of Erfurt. These were really upcoming town. I'm member of the first cohort of professors at the Stavi faculty, and we came with a lot of ideas A lot of them we were able to put into practice, some not. But in the end, it was a great time and also a great experience also for me to move on later on. And so when Heike asked me whether I would love to come here, I say I always love to come back to Erfurt. And yes, this is why I like to be here. And I also taught at the Willy Brandt School. At this time, the name was not Willy Brandt School, but a different one, Erfurt School of Public Policy, so the name changed. And some might know, maybe in good or not so good, my lectures in game theory and well, strategies in politics. So, okay, not so good experience. Okay, I was asked not only to talk about my good memories of the University of Erfurt, but also to give a talk about science and the freedom of science. And this is what I'm going to do here. So, ladies and gentlemen, when reporting on military conflicts and political crises, the impact of such events on science is usually not mentioned. However, for centuries, scientific progress has depended largely on the unhindered exchange of knowledge across national and thus political and cultural borders. The highly international, even global nature of science is one of its strengths. But in the event of geopolitical crisis, it can become an Achilles heel. Even long-standing and close institutional contacts can quickly be damaged when relations between the countries involved deteriorate. The freedom of science then effectively ends at political fault lines. This is very unfortunate. Based on the trust they have in each other, scientists can actually build bridges between countries that have little trust in each other. This year, the Federal Republic of Germany and Israel are celebrating the 60th anniversary of their diplomatic relations. Scientific contacts paved the way for this. As early as the beginning of the 1950s, scientists from both countries began to establish informal networks, a rapprochement that was hardly imaginable just a few years after the end of World War II and the Holocaust. Against this historical backdrop, we should resolutely oppose all calls for boycotts and efforts to question Israel's participation in the EU Research Framework Program. Such attacks on academic freedom in international cooperation are absurd and counterproductive, not least in the view of the important role that Israeli scientists play in defending the liberal constitutional state in Israel. International cooperation between scientists is not only affected by military conflict, it also suffers when states ideologically instrumentalize their science systems, harass them politically, and dismantle them financially. Everyone who has been observing the deliberate destruction of a former world power in science by the government in recent weeks and months has witnessed this. Drastic budget cuts affecting scientific personnel, research projects, and important research infrastructure in numerous scientific fields has been implemented or announced in the United States. In many cases, the collection, maintenance, and dissemination of research data, much of which was compiled with public funds, has been halted or even completely eliminated. Such measures represent a serious restriction of academic freedom in the US and create a climate of fear in which self-censorship becomes a survival tactic. They also have far-reaching consequences for the global scientific community. Whether in climate research or medicine, in the development of new technologies or basic research, the loss of data and expertise also affects researchers in Germany, Europe, and worldwide. Given the global nature of many of the pressing challenges facing humanity, the deep cuts in the American science system are hampering research worldwide, slowing down the advancement of knowledge and reducing the social benefits of science, including for the US. Together with other national academies, the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina, has protested the restrictions on academic freedom in the US and expressed its solidarity with the scientists affected there. We support their open letters and statements calling for the maintenance of funding for scientific institutions, the protection of publicly funded research, and the preservation of academic freedom. Ladies and gentlemen, the increasing pressure on science worldwide is unlikely to decrease significantly overnight. It is uncertain whether we will return to a world in which the global success of liberal democratic forms of government, and thus a solid understanding of academic freedom, seemed only a matter of time. The West's tendency toward dissolution also affects science and its freedom. Anyone who attacks the free, democratic basic order also threatens academic freedom. Anyone who curtails academic freedom damages one of democracy's most important intellectual resources. In Germany, academic freedom enjoys constitutional protection as a fundamental right. Arts and sciences, research and teaching shall be free. This is what the Constitution says in Article 5. Freedom of science is also enshrined as a high legal good in the primary law of the European Union, Article 13 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the European Union, which was proclaimed in 2000 and became legally binding in 2009, states, "The arts and scientific research shall be free of constraint. Academic freedom shall be respected." Freedom of science is not an isolated normative pillar of constitutional democracies. It must interact with other fundamental rights of the liberal constitutional state to be fully realized. However, the political orientation towards the ideal of academic freedom is increasingly at risk of being lost. On the one hand, it is, of course, legitimate to expect science to contribute to economic success, sustainable transformation, and social cohesion. On the other hand, in economically difficult times and with intensifying political tensions, there is a growing suspicion that science is not sufficiently committed to such causes. Should it be urged, or perhaps even forced, in the interest of the common good, to focus more on research questions of high societal relevance? Should we neglect research areas with no discernible application to social challenges? The issue at stake is the demand to make science serve politically determined purposes and to instrumentalize it for realization of social goals if these are given high priority by large sections of the population. The idea is based on a fallacy, that there can be no long-term economic says, without comprehensive support for science does not in any way imply that science should not be cultivated if it directly contributes to economic progress. However, the fallacy underlies the increasing pressure on publicly funded research to promise a predictable economic or social benefit. This may be its usability for technical innovations or its applicability to solve socio-political problems. If this fixation on so-called impact becomes the decisive criterion for eligibility of funding and thus indirectly for scientific quality, not only curiosity-driven basic research is endangered, but also the innovation potential of application-oriented research. The exact boundaries of academic freedom can often only be determined through complex deliberation processes or, in some cases, through a Supreme Court ruling. In a constitutional state, this is normal. However, fundamental problems arise when political interest groups seek to impose their social objectives for or against social areas, certain areas of research by using legal means to restrict academic freedom. In the impenetrable thicket of prohibitions and obligations that will result, the boundary between politics and science is becoming increasingly blurred. Most scientists probably agree that protecting the natural foundations of life is a task for the state. But here too, we must be aware of a false conclusion. Environmental and climate protection as a task of the state should not mean that all publicly funded research must, from the outset, make a demonstrable contribution to the transformation of society in terms of ecological sustainability. Such an obligation would obviate the need to go through the complex process of weighing up important legal interests at the expense of academic freedom and with the risk of reducing the contribution that basic research could make to the common good. It is the diversity of research interests, topics, and methods that constitutes the strengths of a science system and its high potential for social benefit. An analogous relationship between thematic diversity and regulatory simplicity should characterize free discourse on controversial social issues in scientific institutions. Debates on cancel culture and self-censorship vary greatly from place to place. Christian van Köln, a constitutional and administrative law expert and colleague from the University of Cologne, hit the nail on the head when he wrote in a legal analysis of cancel culture in 2021, quote, "Not only does the Grundgesetz not recognize a right to prevent others from expressing themselves, to prevent certain positions from being represented, or to be spared from positions one rejects. It also clearly rejects the idea of such a fundamental right to cancel by guaranteeing freedom of expression." End of quote. In short, quote, "There is no right to refrain from expressing opinions that one finds repugnant." End of quote. Scientific institutions are safe spaces for critical engagement with research results, but not for the sensitive cultivation of worldviews that are immune to criticism. This must be an indispensable part of our institutional understanding of academic freedom. Dear graduates of the Willy Brandt School, My hope is that, despite the varying geopolitical situation, I could convey to you an optimistic view of the great potential that free science holds for the well-being of our nations. What can you do to preserve academic freedom, regardless of whether to continue to work in academia? Not only scientists and graduates, but anyone with a scientific education should repeatedly emphasize to their interlocutors outside science the inestimable value of knowledge-based research for application-oriented research and for the innovation process. Otherwise, we run the risk of our scientific standards for quality and excellence being undermined by the imperative of immediate usefulness, which is interpreted according to the interests of politics, business, and society. One of the intellectual forefathers of academic freedom in Germany, the liberal scholar and educational reformer Wilhelm von Humboldt, spoke in close connection with this very freedom in the scientist's duty of solitude. Wilhelm von Humboldt did not mean to declare the cliché of the antisocial scholar who lives only in his study, unconcerned with world affairs, to be the ideal. Humboldt believed that even if scientists consider their own research to be socially relevant, they should not allow themselves to be overly motivated by this. Otherwise, factors outside of science would have too great an influence on their research. Without the necessary distance from politics, economics, and society, scientific creativity, free cooperation in research, and the ability to critically analyze the circumstances of the time would suffer. The right to freely allow the internal logic of science and the duty not to surrender this right to non-scientific incentives, both together should characterize the personal attitude for which every scientist is responsible. On the one hand, academic freedom is an essential normative prerequisite for the best possible development of scientific rationality. It provides us with a yardstick for criticizing undesirable developments in science policy. This is particularly important in times of geopolitical upheaval. On the other hand, academic freedom must be an ideal that is lived out even under difficult conditions, one that shapes researchers from the beginning of their studies. Otherwise, it loses its authority as a fundamental right. We must never forget this is our daily work, both within and outside universities. We should confidently present the science system as one of our country's strengths and not allow ourselves to be intimidated by adverse circumstances and vocal opponents. Let us do everything in our power to promote the autonomy of our research system and resist an instrumentalist understanding of science that seeks to make research subservient to changing political or economic masters. To this end, let us use our ability as scientists or scientifically educated people to deal rationally with complex questions, rapidly changing boundary conditions, and uncertain consequences for our actions. Dear graduates of the Willy Brandt School, you have successfully completed your interdisciplinary master's degree program in public policy within 2 years. I congratulate wholeheartedly on this achievement. From my own experience, I know that a farewell ceremony like this is an excellent moment to convey pride in one's own achievements with hope for an exciting and fulfilling career. Among you are numerous future decision makers in government, agencies, international organizations, and the nonprofit sector. Some of you will probably remain in academia or return to it later. Regardless of the path you choose, I wish you the best of luck in using your intellectual and personal skills to promote the common good in innovative ways. And always remember, free research is an indispensable partner in this endeavor. Wherever you work, stand up for academic freedom. Thank you for your attention.